there's a number of things happening in our world we wanted to discuss today, including all the things happening in Iran and everything else going on with U.S. President Donald Trump. But one thing we wanted to address, and I'm joined by Mike Wixson, is a fascinating bit of in-depth journalism from the CBC on a shocking bit of spying done by our own government on Indigenous Canadians.
It's not very often you're clicking around in the morning news and something from the late 60s and early 70s becomes a hot topic and, top of the news. But it was fascinating. And apparently the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, their security service at the time, ran a covert surveillance disruption program among the Indigenous community and activists at the time in Canada.
And this was happening in the late 60s to the 70s, basically throughout Pierre Trudeau's reign as Prime Minister of Canada. And I think as Canadians, we have to realize that Canada as a country in the late 60s through the early mid-70s was very different. And unfortunately, our attitude towards Indigenous Canadians was not really something to be proud of back then.
No, and in fact, I think that it was probably that era that brought into focus how much we really needed to focus on healing those relationships.
Absolutely.
This was not a good time and a good moment in federal government, Indigenous activists, and Indigenous community relations. It was really an egregious act of what seems to be illegal surveillance and disruption at a time where the Indigenous people really needed attention the most. Land rights were a big issue. There was, of course, I think this was an era of extreme paranoia among the federal government, but it's just wild to me that so many years later, the details of this are just finally making their ways through the cracks.
And lest you think that we're overstating this, this is from Professor Pat Pasternak, a criminology professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. This is a massive violation of Indigenous political rights, human rights, and privacy. It is morally reprehensible program that sought to criminalize legitimate political organizing. Now, this, Mike, is something we see on Netflix series about stuff that happened in the United States during the Vietnam War with, legitimate democratic protests against the war and how the Nixon government were trying to infiltrate it and spy on it. Well, we had the same thing apparently going on in the RCMP and our own Indigenous Canadians.
This happened, I think, around the Trudeau era is when it came under real investigation. And, it's interesting to me because the timing on this is not great for the RCMP. Just yesterday, the Attorney General came out and said, look, we haven't done any recruitment, basically.
Which shocked all Canadians. Like, well, I thought you had a drive going.
Apparently, it was a mystery to some of our members of Parliament yesterday who hit the House floor saying that they were in the midst of hiring so many people for the RCMP, not having read the report, obviously, of the Attorney General. Having said, or the Auditor General. Having said that, it's a real moment with a focus on the RCMP that is not positive. This arrives the very next day. What do you think first of all, let's talk about the history of the story a little bit.
Sure.
And then we'll see where this goes, maybe in our minds as to, what this means in the future for the RCMP. But let's kind of cover this off a little bit. Investigative journalism was done on this. At the time it was revealed.
Yeah.
During the 80s, some documents were declassified that led to a wider investigative journalism attention on it. But then it seemed to stall. We got the story. We understood that it happened. But to what degree and what was remaining in the story hung in the balance for decades.
Well, the cover-up is always worse than the crime, Mike. And a number of the reporters who tried to access, legal, democratic freedom of information to get documents, it was over 1,300 days of being stonewalled by the government to get their hands on these documents to really itemize everything going on. This is a piece of Canadian history that was being denied to the reporters who were doing their job.
And by the way, if you're a journalist, 4 years of research on something is too much. The story generally will die. Whoever is behind you on the story or whatever energy you have, 4 years is a long time to create diversion, to stonewall, to find another way to hide this. but it does appear that this was being hidden.
And Mike, as a Canadian, I was shocked when all the truth came out about what really happened at residential schools. A, that it was that bad.
You shocked me a minute ago when you explained to me.
The last one closed in Saskatchewan in 1997.
That's recent.
That is very recent. And so as a Canadian, now this comes out through some incredible in-depth research. And you can go to the CBC website and check out, a video and audio clips from a lot of the different people involved. These are educated, patriotic Canadians who happen to be Indigenous Canadians who the government, quite frankly, was spying on.
Now, in really around 1975, the activism among the Indigenous community was at a height.
Yeah.
And that's when they began to look at this and say, hold on a second, have we been infiltrated? Because too much is happening around us. Too many fences are coming up around us that normally wouldn't be there in a democratic, activist process. And so it became noted at that time. And as I say, throughout all these years, very little came out. Declassification in the 80s, and then now, as you say, 4 years of waiting for freedom of information. 4 years of waiting for freedom of information. We now have a better picture of it. This also should be noted in the 80s, 70s, mid 70s. This is where CSIS came from.
Yeah, and CSIS, as we know it, really laid the foundation in the early 80s.
Yeah.
It became to be. And Mike, think about this.
And this is where they separated policing and surveillance and spying, really.
Think about, you're talking about the mid 1970s. So it's a very innocent time in Canada, Canadian history. We didn't even have that was the year before the Montreal Olympics.
Yeah.
Canada was a much smaller country. And what we knew and what we read and what we saw, we knew none of this. This was all being hidden from Canadians. And
you're right. This is an era we had basically
three channels,
all of them, similar news.
Yeah.
You'd see them at everything together.
Right.
And thank goodness that's where our careers were founded. But having said that, it's a really different era now where if this information is going to be out there, it's now going to be highly scrutinized.
Yeah.
It's going to be leveraged by the Indigenous community for certain and with good reason. And it also shines a light on the RCMP. Now, in the 80s, CSIS came out of this.
Yeah.
They were like, okay, the RCMP can't do policing and it can't do spy work at the same time.
Much like the FBI and the CIA in the United States.
Now,
it's two separate things.
It does leave in question what happens with policing in all of the areas where the RCMP is the primary police. If this creates a tarnish on policing for the RCMP, what do they have left?
Mike, it's a great question. Let's face it, in the last decade, the RCMP have had to do some tough explaining about the mass shooting in Nova Scotia, different incidents in BC, up throughout the prairies. New Brunswick. So every province where they're policing, there have been questions and issues and people needing explanations and not getting them. And I understand that, it's a very, very tough job. Obviously, they're understaffed. And they're in a lot of remote communities with not a lot of resources. And that's fine. So maybe this is where it's a nonpartisan government thing. Let's get provincial people, people from the Indigenous community, the First Nations, Assembly of First Nations, the chiefs of the reservation police. Let's get it all together. Let's try to find a better way to police everything and everyone and protect all Canadians.
I don't disagree with that. It does seem like we're at the precipice of something new.
Yeah, this is not
new way.
Yeah, not finger pointing.
No,
because this happened 50 some years ago. Okay, so let's be better. How come we can't hire more? Why don't the young people? I mean, RCMP pay well. It's not like you're poverty. You're going to do very well financially. Can't we get the numbers up and get the policing better?
It's amazing how much effort they did put into it, by the way. At the time, this was not a small operation for the RCMP. This was a major operation.
Oh, this was like something you see in a movie.
Wiretapping, physical surveillance, covert
the
photography.
Big telephoto lens, cameras, and all that.
So it was something that they really did do. And it just makes me wonder, so many years later, what have we missed along the way that was significant as well?
Mike, we have Indigenous Canadians, Indigenous communities in this country that still don't have access to clean drinking water. No, I don't care what party you support. I don't care a premier, a prime minister. That can't happen in Canada in 2026.
No, I think
can't.
We do have a distance to go with our Indigenous community. I think we know that. I mean, reparations and the way that we handle it with respect has changed dramatically, but I think there's a distance to go. This is a reminder of where we came from not so long ago with our Indigenous community here in Canada.
Patriotic means looking out for each other and fixing things together.
True patriotism is being in the country you love, surrounded by people you love, and great weather.
Being a patriot is being a part of your community and caring for it.
It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. Patriotism is the one thing we all share.
It's okay to be critical of government and still be a patriot.
It's gratitude to your country.
Of course I'm a patriot. I'm Canadian. It's my home.
Well, actually, true patriot love is the mission.